Now, as to the story I want to talk about today, let me tell you how this came up. We were having one of our many discussions on the dancarlin.com discussion board, and we got into the subject of Afghanistan. Afghanistan, of course, much in the news lately. There's a election that just happened there the other day, disputed, of course, and we started talking about the overall issue on the discussion boards. And it got so deep, I finally said, look, I'm going to talk about it in the next Common Sense show. I want to get into the subject a little bit. And the reason why is because I was taking the position, as I've taken from day one, that we shouldn't be in Afghanistan. That the chances of having a terrible outcome happen in Afghanistan are too high to justify the risk. And not just that, the things that the president is saying right now is only making the situation worse. Barack Obama had a speech he gave last week in Phoenix, Arizona. And it was one of those partly good speeches, partly bad speeches, because the first part of the speech was all about how he's going to veto any excessive Pentagon spending for weapons programs and stuff we don't need anymore. And if you've been listening to the show, you know that that's something we've been talking about, too. Don't need all these Cold War weapon systems. Military is a little bit bloated compared to our needs and blah, blah, blah. Well, that's not true. If we're going to be the policeman of the world, we need more military, but we don't have to be the policeman of the world, so we don't need to spend all this money. And Barack Obama said that in his speech. So we cheer that side of the speech. But then he said something about Afghanistan, which I think couldn't be the more wrong thing to do. Let me quote from the middle of this story I'm looking at right now. It's an Associated Press piece by Liz Sadati, appeared in the media Tuesday, August 18th, 2009, cutting to the middle of the piece. It says, quote, turning to the two foreign wars engaging the United States, Obama spoke of fierce fighting against Taliban and other insurgents leading up to Thursday's, that would be last Thursday's, national elections in Afghanistan. He said U.S. troops are working to secure polling places so the election can go forward and Afghans can choose their own future. Attaining that peaceful future, quote, will not be quick nor easy, end quote, Obama said. He said the new U.S. strategy recognizes that al-Qaeda has moved its bases into remote areas of Pakistan and that military power alone will not win that war. At the same time, confronting insurgents in Afghanistan, quote, is fundamental to the defense of our people, end quote. Is fundamental to the defense of our people. Ladies and gentlemen, you know me. I'm a bit of a contrarian, and when I hear something like that, a little voice in my head pops up and just finishes like the response to that point. When the president says in a speech that Afghanistan is fundamental to the defense of our people, the little voice says, so what if we lose? The little voice is a pain in the rear sometimes, so what if we lose? You see, what the president has done is up the stakes, folks. He's made it seem like if we don't win the conflict in Afghanistan, our national vital interests have been put at risk and we're in terrible trouble. Now, all you have to do is go back and study the history of the Vietnam War to see that this was something that got our presidents in trouble over and over again in Vietnam, because it limited our flexibility to do what we saw as needed, compared to the situation on the ground, in relation to the situation on the ground. The history now shows that U.S. administration officials knew as early as 1967 that the war in Vietnam was unwinnable. So why didn't they pull out of Vietnam? Well, one big reason was the rhetoric that they had established to, make it clear why we needed to be there was so like this, so off the wall, so over the top, that you had boxed yourself into a position. If you make it this super, super vital thing, then you can't pull back from the brink if you decide, listen, we're not going to win there. We might as well get out. Well, we can't get out. We just told everybody that the whole world's going to go communist. You're going to have this domino effect. If Vietnam falls, Laos will fall, Cambodia will fall, all these other areas will fall, and, the commies will be in Mexico before we know it. So half the people that died in the Vietnam War, ladies and gentlemen, on our side, died after our government realized they couldn't win it. They had boxed themselves into a position where they couldn't get out. When the president makes these kind of pronouncements about Afghanistan, it makes it harder for us to get out if we realize that we can't win, because he just said it was fundamental to this country's security. Now, when I said on the discussion board that I thought this was the wrong place to be, we got into this discussion, and some people brought up a point that I imagine probably resonates with a majority of Americans. They were saying, Dan, you're insane, that we have to stay in Afghanistan because we're destroying terrorist base camps, and anything that we can do to prevent another 9/11 has to be of paramount importance to our foreign policy. Now, this is what I want to address today, because that is an important point. I think the exact line, I wrote it down. There's nothing more important than making sure Americans are not attacked by terrorists again like we were on 9/11. That is the rationale that a lot of these folks who want us to stay in Afghanistan are pushing. Have to do this to prevent 2 more buildings from falling down or a nuclear bomb being smuggled into one of our harbors or something like that. Let me say at the beginning of this little piece that's probably going to be a big piece that I agree with that wholeheartedly. But I think you're taking the small view. Let me take the big view. The premise of this piece is there's nothing more important than making sure Americans are not attacked like we were on 9/11. Now, those who would push Afghanistan as a part of this endeavor will say that we need to stay in a place like that, a failed state, so that we can stabilize it. And then once we stabilize it, it will be a place where the government will prevent, the Afghan government, will prevent terrorists from forming into base camps and using it as a launching point to attack our country. Now, I would say, judging from the latest military, statements about the region, that this is a long shot anyway. In this last week, there have been 3 or 4 more pronouncements from high-level military officials who say the situation is going from bad to worse in Afghanistan. Not just that, new polls have come out showing that for the first time, a majority of Americans oppose expanding the war in Afghanistan and sending more troops to it. In other words, what is already one of the longest wars in American history, a country that, by the way, has proven to have a very short fuse when it comes to putting up with long wars, has already turned the corner in terms of public opinion. This is a bad sign when you're just really starting to get serious about that war. We've been in there basically since 9/11, but we've only gotten serious about fighting it in the last year or so. Bingo, you have a recipe for a disaster when the winning of the war requires intense American support and patience, and they're already fed up with it before we've even sent more troops, okay? So already you have a problem. Let's talk about the specifics of Afghanistan, and then let's broaden it out. Because, ladies and gentlemen, what we're going to talk about here is one of my favorite subjects in the whole world. It's called geopolitics. Combination international relations and geopolitics. And geopolitics sounds like this remarkably complex subject, and I think the people that, focus on this stuff for a living want it to sound that way. But my stepdad was my first teacher in geopolitics, and what he taught me about this is what all of us should know, is that geopolitics is one of the easiest subjects out there in the world. And I'm going to explain to you in this piece how it relates to Afghanistan and the region and our foreign policy and everything else, and then how it relates to this idea that the most important thing in our foreign policy is keeping another, 9/11 or worse from happening on American soil. Start with Afghanistan. Afghanistan is the worst place for us to be fighting in the world. If you were going to look at the map of the world and say areas you do not want to become embroiled in, I can't think of a worse place than Afghanistan. People like to look at the Vietnam War and point out how it was tailor-made for a guerrilla insurgency with all the jungle and all the places to hide and the ferociousness of the Vietnamese as a people to have as an enemy. Afghanistan is just as bad. You throw in the Muslim fundamentalist religion as a motivating force, which to me reminds me of the communist ideology that was motivating a lot of the Vietnamese and the nationalism that was motivating the Vietnamese. You throw in also the fact that they have a heroin trade, an opium trade, opium would be a better word, that funds some of this stuff. Throw in the corruption of all parties involved in Afghanistan, which also reminds you of the South Vietnamese government, a very corrupt government, very hard for us to work with, caused all kinds of problems that wouldn't have happened if that government had not been so corrupt. We're dealing with that right now in Afghanistan. And then throw in the part that Americans seem to know the littlest about, but that is absolutely 100% the most important part in Afghanistan. And this is something you normally have to go and read European papers or Middle Eastern papers if you want to get a really good feel for this aspect of the Afghan conflict, the part that is the most important. We Americans like to focus on the ideologies and the terrorism and, but folks, the situation in Afghanistan, the most important part of it is ethnic. People don't realize that in this country. I have these conversations with people, and the faces just kind of glaze over. They don't get it. Part of this is, the United States has never been one of those countries in modern times. Let's remember how we were about African Americans and other peoples in this country. But in modern times, Americans just don't get race and ethnicity the way they do in some of these more tribal areas of the world. Afghanistan was involved in a civil war when we went in there, folks. A war between a couple of different ethnic groups that have been fighting in Afghanistan on and off for a very long time.